The first people of China were the native tribal group in central China. From there, they migrated across East Asia from Japan to Indonesia. This created the genetic pool of modern East Asians and Southeast Asians. But for the group that stayed in central China, they faced the Yellow River, one of the nastiest rivers in the world, as it changed its course by hundreds of miles in this flat region of central China. Because of this, they needed cooperation to build dams to stop the Yellow River from killing thousands and to provide them with water for farming. This cooperation led to Chinese forming Stone Age farms and villages that grew larger over time. The Chinese might claim that their civilization goes back to 300 BC, but this is unlikely. The more likely scenario is that they formed many small fiefdom, and the biggest one of all of them is the Shang state. The Shang were an ethnic Han theocracy based in the North Chinese plain around 1600 BC. As priests who communicated with the gods formed the basis of the elite, ancient Chinese were much like other ancient peoples in the Middle East. They were like the Babylonians and Egyptians, civilizations that formed to manage rivers, which then formed theocracies to manage the workers, with priests or kings to mediate between the gods that controlled the weather. This religious tradition continues to this day. The first people of China were the native tribal group in central China. From there, they migrated across East Asia from Japan to Indonesia. This created the genetic pool of modern East Asians and Southeast Asians. But for the group that stayed in central China, they faced the Yellow River, one of the nastiest rivers in the world, as it changed its course by hundreds of miles in this flat region of central China. Because of this, they needed cooperation to build dams to stop the Yellow River from killing thousands and to provide them with water for farming. This cooperation led to Chinese forming Stone Age farms and villages that grew larger over time. The Chinese might claim that their civilization goes back to 300 BC, but this is unlikely. The more likely scenario is that they formed many small fiefdom, and the biggest one of all of them is the Shang state. The Shang were an ethnic Han theocracy based in the North Chinese plain around 1600 BC. As priests who communicated with the gods formed the basis of the elite, ancient Chinese were much like other ancient peoples in the Middle East. They were like the Babylonians and Egyptians, civilizations that formed to manage rivers, which then formed theocracies to manage the workers, with priests or kings to mediate between the gods that controlled the weather. This religious tradition continues to this day. The Jia took power from the Shang monarchy through an ideology called the Mandate of Heaven. In it, heaven gives power to the emperor to govern, but if the ruler is not moral, heaven can take back that power so rebels can then seize power. The idea lasted for 3,000 years of Chinese history, as it was even invoked during the Tiananmen Square protests. The idea inspired John Locke's idea of the social contract that justified the American and French revolutions. The idea has checked many tyrannies in Chinese history. The Chinese have had an accurate view of history. They realize that they will see their leaders govern well for a while, then the leaders become bad, peasant rebellions and famines happen, then a new rebel takes power. After a period of war, things restart. This has happened many times in Chinese history. After the Jia, the Zhou Dynasty was then established as the first proper state structures of China. The Zhou had fewer states, but there were more small fiefdom of family clans inside this state. The fewer states then organized their little states, and these states became more centralized. This is not a sudden change. It is a slow process that has taken place over centuries. By the late Zhou period, these states started to make bigger bureaucracies. They collected taxes, introduced currencies, and had standing armies. They also used standard measurements and units. The political force that drove the shaping of the first Chinese state was not internal political or economic development but war. The spring and autumn period lasted 294 years. During it, people fought 1,210 wars with only 38 years of peace. They conquered or destroyed 110 states. In the next 254 years of the Warring States period, the 23 remaining states fought 468 wars. They only had 89 years of peace. Only 7 states remained after destroying 16 states. This was 548 years of constant war. This is unique in human history for its length and the huge number of people killed. While Rome was still a collection of huts, tens of thousands were dying in China. The state sent armies to battle to dominate all of China. This period shaped China. We can almost understand it like Darwinian evolution. Chariots dominated Chinese warfare before this. Their riders had to fire arrows, a very hard skill to learn. This led one state to opt for easier and cheaper cavalry. It gained the upper hand until others also adopted cavalry in the military. This led to a competition over who could run the best yet cheap army. It resulted in the invention of conscription and standard army units. It led to the formation of an officer corps. These leaders earned their promotions based on merit, not family or noble standing. War also affected civil development, as states competed to run the most efficient state to support their wars. They started to tax land and harvest, not based on kin group, but based on land and harvest size. They introduced population surveys to count potential recruits. They set up conscription offices, field irrigation, and land management offices, and also introduced a system of meritocracy like in the army. This system produced state bureaucrats who earned their hiring and promotions based on merit, not family connections. As China grew, it experienced a time called the Axial Age, a period when new intellectual and philosophical ideas developed. China developed many ideas during the Warring States in the Axial Age. This period produced writers such as Laozi, Sun Tzu, and Confucius, whom the West calls Confucius. It also produced the 5 great classics that were compiled in the late Zhou Dynasty. As these thinkers often wandered between states, they helped build and organize states while writing their philosophies. Confucius developed a system that believes that all people have social duties to the people in our social networks. People must follow these duties, which include the loyalty of children to their parents, the loyalty of employees to employers, and ruler to ruled. Meanwhile, they expect that bosses will exchange employer loyalty for helpful guidance. Confucianism is a social theory masquerading as a religion. Confucianism had a series of effects on China. The first was immense social cohesion. Countries with Confucianism have the world's lowest crime. The Chinese have died in wars with immense courage too many times to count. Confucianism stressed the duties of rulers and ruled, making China one of history's most enlightened despotisms. Chinese regimes often have the kindest rulers than anywhere else in Asia. The Chinese abolished slavery before the birth of Christ, and the value of education in Confucianism is the reason why these societies excel in academic subjects today. But Confucianism was the reason China is so conservative. Confucius was the most conservative philosopher, as he wanted to turn back the clock to the world that existed 500 years before him. It aimed to return to the social code of the early Zhou Dynasty. The Chinese have always looked to the past and have had trouble dealing with the future. This has held them back in military, economic, and technological ability because they couldn't keep up with the times. Another important part of Confucianism is that it promoted hierarchy in Chinese society. When Westerners deal with Chinese organizations, they're often shocked in meetings. Only the leader speaks. The lesser members of the organization stay quiet. China also developed Taoism as a religion in this time. In many ways, it is the opposite of Confucianism. Taoism is a mix of folk beliefs pretending to be a religion. It believes a few things. First, it holds the idea that there's a way to follow. This way involves going with the flow and not trying to force things. Second, it believes in magical rituals. So, Confucianism was for public life, and Taoism was for the private. As philosophers tried to figure out how to live a noble and good life, they created a rich culture of education. Literacy became a cornerstone of Chinese society and government. This happened earlier than in any other civilization. This created a rich intellectual heritage on statesmanship and warfare that would become a national treasure. It would also underpin Chinese education and statesmanship for thousands of years. In the Warring States period, as states kept battling and weeding each other out for 500 years in survival of the fittest, Qin was the most innovative and efficient state. It then conquered and unified all of China. In this period, something specific happened. It was the creation of the first social structures we can call a state. They had standing armies, ruled territory, and collected taxes. They enforced laws and made unified weights and measurements. They built public infrastructure like roads, grain silos, canals, and dikes. The Qin would unify China. They did so due to one political development among these states. It was that they enforced strict legalism. They promoted and hired military officers and generals based on their record and merit rather than on family ties. It was the first unified Chinese state. It emerged from the unification and conquest of many smaller states. It was also strict legalist meritocracy. The Qin had built a legalist state that had an efficient merit-based bureaucracy. It bypassed family lines in favor of those with the best record. It split the land into prefectures and appointed governors based on merit. It then tried to break apart the entrenched family lines and aristocracy of China. During Qin rule, the government displaced over 100,000 families from their land. They deported them to distant regions to break up lineages. They standardized the written and spoken language in its domain. This created the foundation of what would become China. The Qin emperor then ordered the burning of all Confucian philosophy books and history books. He did this to crack down on the ideas behind the traditional family hierarchies. This, in part, is why Confucian scholars wrote so badly about the Qin. This is also the first instance of Sinicization. The stereotypes about China are not even about Han Chinese. The tight silk dresses and their long hairstyle are not Han Chinese but Manchu, who were a minority in northern China that ruled the empire for the last 200 years. The Han Chinese came from the Yellow River Basin. As the Han conquered their neighbors, they didn't only tax them and make them tributaries as so many ancient empires do. Instead, they engaged in aggressive cultural assimilation. As they imposed Han culture, festivities, taxes, administration, laws, and marriages on conquered peoples. Once done, the conquered peoples would become Han. Then they would do the same to those they conquered. This process repeated for thousands of years. From a small kingdom at the basin of the Yellow River, it expanded from the deserts of Central Asia to the Himalayas and the steppes of Mongolia, the jungles of Southeast Asia, from Turkic horsemen, Koreans migrants, and Vietnamese. The Chinese assimilated them all into one empire and culture. Now, few ethnic enclaves remain. To show how effective this process was, look at the indigenous people of what we now know as Taiwan. They were dark-skinned seafaring Austronesians, fishermen communities that originated from Madagascar. Because of their relationship, they shared more language and culture with the New Zealand Maori or Hawaiians than the Chinese. But when the Chinese arrived in the 1600s, over 400 years, Sinicization turned them into Chinese with bits of their culture. Throughout the next centuries, China will change many groups. The Qin introduced a strict code of law. They did so to spread and harden their strict merit-based legalism across China. One of these laws punished being late with death. And what happened because of this law? Well, when army commander in 210 BC noticed that he was going to be late, He realized that the punishment for being late was the same as the punishment for rebellion. So he decided to rebel. The rebellion turned into an uprising, bringing down the Qing and replacing it with the Han Dynasty. The Han took over when the Qing collapsed, but they kept the empire. They did not want China divided into kingdoms again, and this is how China would continue throughout the next 2,000 years. This makes China unique, as it never really fell. Yes, it did sometimes fall apart into warring states, but those were civil conflicts over who should rule a united China. They were not wars to dissolve China. China has been a state, social contract, society, and political construct for 2,000 years. Some might even say 3,000 years. There is no other society that can claim this. Yes, you get occasional claims to the past. The French claim their ancestry from the Celtic Gauls. The Iranians claim ancestry to the Achaemenid Empire. But these are claims of cultural heritage, not of a continuous society or government. France did not exist 2,000 years ago. It didn't even exist 1,000 years ago. While Iran is a nation that someone made up in the 19th century, and has had many changes in politics and society in the last 3,000 years. Compared to China's history over the last 3,000 years, the European state doesn't seem to have a history. The Chinese have a strong political structures, state, and social contracts that can last almost unchanged for 3,000 years. They lasted to a degree even to this very day. To show how special this is, imagine the Roman Empire had never split up and stopped existing. Imagine it still existed today, ruling over Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa as one state. China created the first state. It did so millennia before everyone else. The structures of that first state endure to this day. This is why China may be the only country in the world that is not a nation-state but a civilization state. The clue that holds China together is stronger than nationalism, language, or mere ideology. It is its culture. The political scientist Lushan Pai expresses it in a famous quote. He said that China is a civilization disguised as a nation. The Qing has established the empire, but then collapsed. The Han then took it over. They say they hate legalism, but they just rename it with a Confucian name, and the ideal of the Chinese government is still legalism. These events reinforced a political conflict over societal structure, a conflict that endures to this day. The conflict is between the state and the family. It is patrimonialism against meritocracy. It is legalism versus Confucianism. Ancient China under the Axial period had family lineages, traditions that later became Confucianism, a code of conduct that formed the basis for them. It says that family and patrimonialism are key to society's harmony. In Confucian society, the state and its laws are tools to help the emperor. He, through moral family virtues, should already have the sound reasoning to govern well. The only checks on the emperor's power were moral, not institutional. The Qing created a legalist state envisioned by Han Fei. In this state, what mattered was merit, education, record, and not the family. The law was not a guideline, but a strict code of conduct for everyone. It emphasized education and skill. A bureaucrat must go to institutions of learning to serve the state for a greater purpose, as they must prove their worth through merit. The idea of a strict merit-based state with an educated and efficient bureaucracy endured after the Qing. It is the main idea of Chinese statesmanship to this day, and the main barrier for Chinese family rule. These two political concepts competed for centuries as they argued about the governance of China. The Han Dynasty kept the empire and kept its institutions, but Confucianism made a huge comeback under the Han. Confucian bureaucrats dominated the Han state's bureaucracy. They did not seek raw power. They were custodians of family lines and moral traditions. However, even though the central government became more formal to help with tax collection and civil control of the army, The Han state did not unify and standardize all of China's governance. It allowed local rulers to form family lineages and traditions to remain. The result was that the state grew to look like what we now call a modern bureaucratic state. But this made governments in the regions that are far from the capital to be almost tribal. The Han also set up the Chinese Imperial Model that lasted until the 20th century. The Han was like the Roman Empire of China. They expanded the Chinese Empire to the greatest extent at that time. These borders lasted until the present. The empire had colonies in Central Asia and Vietnam. There have been three types of Chinas in history. The weakest is a Han-controlled China in the south, and barbarians control the north. The second is Han-controlled. It is when China controls places that are ethnically majority Han, called China proper. The third is the most successful. It is when China maintains colonies in Turkestan, Central Asia, and Vietnam. But it's hard to supply armies there in the pre-industrial world, as transportation not by water was very expensive. So when Chinese armies fought in places like Tajikistan, it must be imagined as like American armies fighting on the moon in the 20th century. As the Qing Dynasty had pushed its state-building project too far to legalism and disrupted regional elites who then rebelled, the Han, due to different circumstances, drove their state-building project too far in the opposite direction. They weakened the central state so much until it couldn't face regional patrimonial elites. The Han Dynasty ended up collapsing into the famous Three Kingdoms period. In many ways, it was a collapse into family power again, as China fell into warring states run by family clans instead of meritocratic institutions. And as the struggle of feuding family clans continued, the Sui managed to reunite China again. The Sui Dynasty did not last long. Its second emperor was a megalomaniac who used state power to build a massive wall. This wall caused a famine. Even more, he invaded Vietnam and Korea, which ended in disaster and bankruptcy of the state. A rebellion followed that established the Tang Dynasty. The Tang were from a prominent nomadic family in northern China that then enforced the system of family appointments in the legalist states. These nomadic peoples kept their aggression, and under their rule, the Chinese Empire reached its greatest extent ever seen in its history. They managed to do this because the Tang were barbarian descendants and used barbarian allies to control Central Asia. They did this more than any other Chinese dynasty because the barbarian conquerors were foreigners. They were open to a foreign culture. This was China's big era of cosmopolitanism. The capital had Christian, Muslim, Persian, and Saudi people. This was also when Buddhism came to China, the last big change before Europeans came. Buddhism was similar to Taoism, as they give a break from the rules of Confucianism, as it had monasteries to escape Confucianism's stifling rules, and class honor, because under Confucianism women are extremely discriminated against. One thing to make clear is that due to different circumstances, Mahayana Buddhism in China is the opposite of Buddhist teaching. This is due to the long game of telephone it took to reach China. Buddha designed a nihilistic, atheistic, psychological journey, while Buddhism, as it developed in China, is an optimistic group religion. For example, it said not to turn his faith into non-faith, not to turn his creed into a religion with demons, metaphysical views of the world like God, and magical rituals. And don't took the outward trappings of a religion like a priest's. But Mahayana Chinese Buddhism did every single one of those things. Mahayana Buddhism mixed with Zoroastrianism in Persia that then was routed to China, where it blended with Chinese customs and became something that bore no resemblance to what it was in India. The Confucius families that the Tang Dynasty championed didn't provide a basis for good leadership from family traditions. But the return of this system led to even more scheming among families around the royal court to gain power. This ended with the woman known in Chinese records as the evil Empress Wu. She took control of the royal court through plots. These plots involved the murder of her political rivals, the killing of the heir to the throne, and the appointment of her son as the heir. Under her rule, the state administration saw most of its Confucian scholars and aristocrats murdered or kicked out and replaced by her loyal agents willing to do her bidding. In this case, we see how an elite utilized the powerful state in China to inflict terror on the country. Even though the elite's victims had strong family connections, this imperial China ended with the Lushan Rebellion. It was the bloodiest rebellion in history up to that point, as Turk chieftains led a rebellion against a government and killed more people than World War I, killing the nobility and turning China into a Confucian-run bureaucracy that set China's path for the next 1,000 years. The rebels lost, but they changed almost every part of China. Because of the Lushan Rebellion, China had trouble relying on barbarian noble elites that had dominated much of the military. And after the fall of Tang, it is replaced by the Song. The Song marked the start of the Neo-Confucian Renaissance, resulting from the strengthening of the bureaucracy from the death of the noble because of the Lushan Rebellion. This is also a period of an important shift, as it was the settling of southern China. In early China, the center of the population was in the grain-growing north. However, better rice farming and adapting to the south's malarial climate caused the population of southern China to boom in the Middle Ages. This rice-growing and malarial population made China soldiers worse because irrigation populations suffered diseases like ringworms that made them weaker. This is why China's capital and center of power has always been in the north. The shift to the south took China from being a northern warlike society to a water-based commercial one. This is all thanks to the construction of the Grand Canal that went from southern to northern China over hundreds of miles. It fed northern China with southern rice, keeping the two regions together. We could have seen a world where South China had become independent, but this construction segmented its unity. All this came to an end when the Mongols invaded China. But, as usual, China's massive population meant that the Mongols assimilated into Han culture and became the Yuan Dynasty. Because of massive drought and famine, there was a massive Han rebellion called the Yellow Turban Rebellion that dissolved the Yuan into the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty refocused on the building of a legalist Chinese state under meritocracy. They did this by building canals and going on famous foreign expeditions. They also cut the state in half. They did this to be more efficient and to stop the rise of inept or powerful family lines. The state bureaucracy entrenched itself as the Ming resorted to the posting of eunuchs as ministers of the state. Eunuchs in power have been common in China, as it is assumed a eunuch could not advance family interests in the state due to his condition. The Ming created an effective state bureaucracy. Eunuch bureaucrats formed the basis of it. It was also based on the system of exams. The Ming emperors trusted these eunuchs more than the aristocratic families. They assumed that the eunuchs would not betray them. Over 100,000 eunuchs ended up serving in the Ming Dynasty. But as bureaucrats do, they are very conservative and make China a very conservative nation. Take the famous voyages of Zhang He in the early 15th century. The Chinese had the best boats. They sailed to Eastern Africa and got tribute from Indian Ocean nations, sailing from the East Indies and even possibly to the Pacific coast of America. In this time, China was growing in population, so colonialism would have made sense. But only one emperor pushed the voyages. After his death, the isolationist bureaucrats had no interest in colonies. They burned all the ships and turned China inwards. And as the eunuchs were becoming more and more trusted, the Ming started sending them out as spies. They went to aristocratic families to punish those who had disobeyed the emperor. By the 15th century, the eunuchs had become a huge secret police organization called the Eastern Depot, and they ruled the country with terror. And as the emperors lost control over the state institution that they had created, the eunuchs gained more control over the royal court. And then they became corrupt and dropped the stability of this dynasty. This solidifies the bureaucrat hijacking of society, which led to rebellion and the conquest of the Qing Dynasty. The examples of the Ming and the Sui show that both legalist and patrimonial states could collapse into despotism and state terror. One of the key weaknesses of the Chinese state is its lack of any upward accountability. Even if China have good mid-level government, they always run into the problem of the bad emperor. As the Chinese state is a state built around power collecting at the top, with the authority of the state acting out from the top to the bottom, this unique development allowed for the creation of a powerful state. The state could do mass mobilization to build huge projects. These include the Great Wall, the modern Three Gorges Dam, and the high-speed rail. But this structure also made despotism and state terror easy. The rulers had little, if any, public accountability. This was true for figures like Empress Wu, the Cultural Revolution, and modern crackdowns on dissent. This means challenging the Chinese state is slow because it involves raising complaints through state institutions to reach the top. The strength of the Chinese state depends on the integrity of its institutions and bureaucrats. The Chinese state must remain meritocratic to work, but it must also balance this with avoiding despotism and stopping the rise of interest groups. Unlike Western democracies, there is no direct way for the public to influence state decisions in China. In 1644, the Han Chinese faced more humiliation from nomadic conquerors. This time it was the Manchus. They conquered China with 100-to-1 odds, but they then assimilated into Chinese culture. All the cultural trends from the Ming Dynasty continued under the foreign Manchu Qing Dynasty. For almost 2,000 years, the world revolved around China. Empires, kingdoms, and republics, they all wanted to trade with China. From Europe, the Middle East, and America, China has dominated history, with an exception of the last 200 years. Viewing history from a Eurasian perspective, China's politics, market, and products dominated economies in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa for 2,000 years, as China had the world's largest and most efficient labor pool. China's main exports were the world's most wanted products: silk, tea, salt, sugar, porcelain, and spices. The only payment they accepted was silver, and so the world agreed. European, Asian, and African states fought wars to control these trade routes. Greeks, Romans, Persians, Byzantium, Venetians, Indians, Mongols, Arabs, and Turks fought many of these wars. Our history books are just histories of wars fought for advantage to trade with China or ports to China. As China was the dominant power in the Eurasian world order, they shaped history, as squabbles and war happened because states wanted the privilege to trade with China. Look at how during the 1300s, the Ottomans gained control of trade routes between Europe and China. They kept control for hundreds of years. Europeans didn't like trading with Muslims, let alone paying tariffs to them, so they tried finding ways around it. The English and Dutch tried sailing around Russia, where they only found more Russia. The Spanish sailed west to a place they had never heard of, the Americas, and the Portuguese sailed around Africa, and they did find new trade routes to China. As only one of them succeeded, this new route meant the Portuguese had to pay no more tariffs and taxes. It was so profitable that they tried to keep it secret, but that failed. Others soon tried taking it from them. The Spaniards found silver in the New World. They used it in their transactions with China. They even gained a foothold in the Philippines to be closer to that Chinese trade route. History is shaped by states wanting to trade with China. But the New World, where all the silver is mined, would change the world order. Settlers started to grow crops on what turned out to be some of the most fertile lands in the world. They produced a surplus that could sustain a large population, increasing the labor pool of the Western Hemisphere. They expanded trade through innovation. They made products that decreased reliance on those Eastern markets. And the English and Dutch noticed that they could occupy India and Indonesia instead of buying through the Chinese. This hurt China's power. China seemed less important. Trade routes to India, the Caribbean, Malacca, the Gold Coast, Brazil, and North America became more important. By the time Europeans learned to make their porcelain, China's role in global trade and affairs shrank. Industrialization and better education moved the geopolitical center away from China. The world shifted from a Eurasian world order to a more European one. This shift finished in 1839. That year, the British Navy forced the Chinese to open their market and trade with them on their terms. From then on, the main global powers were in the Western Hemisphere. They squabbled over who was the most dominant. One of them ended up on top: the British. The period from the 1800s to today has many names. One is Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, or the Modern Age, as one of many names for the age that began with European expansion in the 1400s. It came after almost 2,000 years in which China stood at the center. The age began with the goal of finding new trade routes to China, but it ended with Europeans taking, not buying, from China and gaining geopolitical influence. During the centuries of European global dominance, you shouldn't forget a key aspect of it. The Chinese also have a name for it, and it is the Age of Humiliation. In this era, China endured a century of humiliation marked by foreign influence and interference, including the Boxer Rebellion and wars with Japan, a kingdom once viewed as just a barbarian state resulting in the loss of Korea. China also faced the British-backed drug trade, where opium was smuggled into the country to correct the trade imbalance, devastating the Chinese spirit. This led to a war that the government lost, fueling public resentment and sparking numerous rebellions, including a Christian uprising that claimed millions of lives and ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Qing Dynasty into a fragmented state. China has maintained the same system for 3,000 years. During this period, an absolute monarch ruled with the mandate of heaven, legitimizing their authority as they upheld harmony through grace. Contrasting this continuity with Europe, which underwent fundamental changes over the same time frame from ancient Rome to the French Revolution. Why wouldn't them? China had a great starting position in the game of civilizations. The city was in a fertile valley. It had a large labor pool and resources everyone wanted. It had technology that made products everyone wanted, and it had natural borders that made it hard to invade. So, for 3,000 years, the worst that happened was a few invasions by Mongols that then stayed and became Chinese, thereby not changing anything, and the country splitting up into warring states who couldn't agree on who should be emperor of all of China. It was a comfortable situation to be in, and that's where China's problems began. It was too comfortable, as what they wanted and needed was at their doorstep, and so, a state policy and philosophy that wanted to keep everything as the same developed. It shunned outside influences, innovations, and reforms as they saw outsiders as mere barbarians who should be grateful that the emperor took their silver. Meanwhile, when the Arabs, Turks, and then Europeans innovated and explored to get what the Chinese already had, the Chinese sat back because they had all they ever wanted. The result was a political culture of complacency. And when the British first trading missions came to China offering the newest and best technology in deep-water navigation, naval, military, and education, the Chinese rejected their offer. In Latin, as Latin was the language of the Europeans they had had trade deals with in the past. For them, the fact that the Romans had stopped existing over 1,000 years ago didn't matter to them. As in their cultural mindset, the Romans and the British were the same barbarians to them. This technology is just barbarian tech and trinkets. The British should be grateful the emperor would take their silver for a few tea leaves. For an 18th century Chinese, only one thing lasted and good, and that was the Chinese Empire and its mandate. It had lasted for thousands of years. Compared to that, who were the British with their ships, muskets, and a modern army? That is nothing compared to 3,000 years of imperial rule. What could they do? Well, they would be shocked when the barbarian ended their world order. Many countries have colonial legacies, but few places have a legacy as bad as here. China suffered a century of foreign domination. Unlike its neighbors, its emperors refused to adapt to the modern world. This created a growing number of dissenters. They concluded that the old world had to be overthrown. So, the world's longest continuous social order and monarchy ended when China formed its first republic in 1911. But things continued as they did before, just under new flags. China split into warring states, as it had many times before. The strongest strongmen eliminated the others until only one remained. They had completely new mandates of heaven, but this time, a foreign force intervened. The Japanese claimed to liberate, but instead, they slaughtered their way through the country in acts of cruelty and barbarity that the world had seldom seen before or since. In the end, China got a new mandate of heaven, written by a German aimed to establish heaven on earth. Communist China had also lost all of Chinese geopolitical influence. This loss led to great isolation. Its leader, with the same wisdom that caused a famine, decided to further that isolation. From 1950 on, Communist China went to war to fight border skirmishes with all its neighbors. This culminated in 1979 as a battered America in Vietnam stopped the fighting. The Chinese invaded and ended with humiliation. By the 1980s, the global economy was roaring, and international trade boomed like never before. And China was one of the most isolated nations in the world. At that time, it had more in common with North Korea than any other country. China was a nation of indoctrinated, almost starving peasants in boiler suits. They recited the texts of the dear leader at every opportunity. But it entered an era of economic restructuring under Deng Xiaoping. It did so not to gain wealth and power, but to escape international isolation. China has lost much in the last decades: dignity, brains, global influence, and more. All it had to show for it was second-hand ramshacks and a Viet nuclear weapons program. But it still had one very valuable asset: the world's largest labor pool. Just like in the Soviet Union, the Chinese economy was stagnant and dysfunctional by the 1970s. The Soviet Union did not see this. The Chinese Communist Party did. They saw that poverty would be a disaster. So, it introduced an economic reform program. First, they broke up the collectivized farms and gave the land back to the peasants. The Chinese would no longer achieve communism. Then they permitted private enterprise and foreign investment. China was to be the world's factory for plastic rubbish. The small independent peasants had a reliable food supply. But as more companies moved production to China, its government abolished price controls. This allowed people to sell at market prices. The government privatized state industries and reopened the Shanghai Stock Exchange. For the first time in 40 years, the Chinese were themselves invested in the private economy. They attempted political liberalization, but the government insists it never happened. Large economic liberalization didn't occur until the 2000s. At that point, the state had to relinquish its businesses. They cut down Mao's large welfare state. Large-scale privatization made a large percent of China's economy private. The scale of China's economic growth left most of the world baffled. Americans who championed a policy of market liberalization for decades called capitalist offensive failed. They think that open markets, free trade, and individual wealth would bring freedom, as the new middle class demanded political freedoms, hastening the regime's downfall. But the world faced authoritarian capitalism instead. Some analysts think this is a new thing, but the truth is that both terror and free markets have always existed. Most dictatorships fell to revolutions from the hungry poor revolting, not the middle class seeking power. But it would also be wrong to see China as a simple capitalist state and to think it's no longer communist. Its largest growth happened when it returned to conservatism. Communists took power and tightened single-party state control. They stopped privatization and created national champions. These were state-owned industries, and their managers got big bonuses for running businesses that competed with private ones. The new communist power is not in the Politburo. It stretches from the streets to social media to corporate boardrooms. The companies have to obey the Communist Party line. The uncomfortable truth was China's growth blinded the world. It prevented them from seeing how its society developed. China removed statues of Marx and communist icons. They replaced them with statues of Confucius, Laozi, and Sun Tzu. Western observers saw this as a shift from Marxist doctrine to traditional values. This shift happened as China liberalized its market. They let those who had been disenfranchised to come back for their revenge. But they were wrong. Confucius, Laozi, and Sun Tzu were not free market pioneers or paragons of democracy. They were the founding philosophers of a socially conservative Chinese imperial doctrine. It aimed to preserve the status quo through social harmony. This harmony came from obedience to authority and knowing your place in society. These were values that the Chinese could identify with through a historical identity, proud of the nation's pre-communist past. But they also value things that serve the desires of the Chinese state. The state must always preserve harmony in all policies. As every communist entity inherits the struggles and ambitions of the entities it replaces, China is no different. For example, the Soviet Union sought warm ports and dominion in Eastern Europe, similar to the Russian Empire. East Germany sought prestige like past German states. Vietnam and Poland sought independence like their predecessors. Communist China inherited a revived nationalism. It also inherited the desire to assimilate outsiders. But China also shared the goal to restore power lost during the century of humiliation, a time where China was the top global power with a vast tributary system under it. Many foreign kings bowed to them. Korea and Persia bowed to the emperor's will. Arab and African kings lined up to pay tribute. The islands of Malaysia and Indonesia had kings and sultans bending to the emperor. And China is determined to reclaim its former glory. The best way is by observing how others gained it. In the 1850s, the Chinese economy collapsed as cheap products flooded the market and the Chinese couldn't compete. This gave foreign producers power over the Chinese economy. But then they turned this concept around. Now they will be the exporter. The British took Hong Kong in 1843 by leasing it from China for 99 years as part of war reparations that China had to pay. Now, Chinese built a large system of loans for countries that had trouble from instability and their regimes unwelcome by Western creditors. Sri Lanka, for example, had a long civil war with many human rights violations. But it sits on a linchpin of the global economy, shipping between Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Sri Lanka took a large loan to build a deepwater port. It was to take part in global trade and profit from its good location. But Sri Lanka couldn't pay back the loan to the Chinese government. The Chinese had a simple solution: lease China this port for 99 years. Now China owns and controls a port at one of the world's most important locations. The Dutch and Portuguese built a vast trading empire by setting up small trade ports and forts called factories. These let them establish and guard exclusive trade routes around the world. Today, China creates the string of pearls as they build infrastructure in Malaysia and fill it with Chinese workers. From here, we can see what China doesn't seem new. It's almost like they spent the last century studying the histories of past empires and thought of ways to copy them. What is going on here is an obvious Chinese attempt to control the trade networks of the Indian and East Asian Oceans. What is less obvious is what you don't see when you connect the dots. Not a single path leads to India. This is not a power play. It aims to isolate its main rival from participating in constructing the global trade networks. China also exploits democratic nations with what democratic nations perceive as their strengths. For example, the mining boom was the perfect start as the coal mine in Australia was sold to China to create jobs in Australia. It made those jobs dependent on China and formed the backbone of the economy. From coal to milk to aluminum to beef, a third of all Australian exports go to China. Chinese billionaires with ties to the Communist Party are investing in Australian businesses. They are donating to candidates and seeking ever more influence. Many Australian politicians had to resign as they took large donations or outright bribes. The money came from wealthy Chinese individuals with close ties to the Beijing Politburo. China also presented itself to Labour as fellow social democrats concerned with the welfare of young people, while it presented itself to conservatives as savvy investors and job creators. This ensured that no matter who was in the Prime Minister's office, China had close ties to the inner circles of the Australian government. Beijing would get its slice of the cake. Anti-racism and social justice groups with close ties to Beijing set out to find and shame those who spoke of Chinese influence. Meanwhile, China started buying valuable Australian assets sold off by conservative governments. This is not only happening in Australia, but all over the world as China grows its influence. This is very significant. For comparison, at the height of its power, the Soviet Union was terrifying. It was an ideological empire determined to spread its policies and doctrines as wide as possible. It was ruthless with any dissidents. It owned the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It had one of the world's most sophisticated spy networks, and it was more than able to use its huge military to bully and fight others into submission. But the only thing the Soviet Union could do to influence the policies of European democracies was to threaten and hope it didn't backfire. Despite all its military might, the only measure the Soviets have is hard power. While China accomplished something the Soviets couldn't even dream: soft power. Because China play a role in the European democracies as an interest group, as an economic and financial partner who can influence their policies from the inside and sway political decisions. It has silenced critique with mere finance and pushed for agendas and cabinets that go in its favor. And it did all this without force. As Western democracies continue to bicker, China will try to dominate and try to re-establish the Chinese century. One of the greatest strengths when the state dominates is the state can provide unity and cohesion. Chinese civilization is unique in its politics, as the state subsumed the society. If Chinese citizens were to protest state policies, they would fail. The Chinese state is absolute and powerful, but lacks public accountability systems. It easily can collapse into tyranny and abuse of power under the wrong leadership. China also faced the problem of clientelism as the family clans entrenched themselves. They subverted the state structures. The Confucian family structure is the biggest threat to the Chinese state. The social contract today is they trade freedom for development. And when this contract is not obligated, the social order is going to be destroyed. The Chinese are loyal people for a certain period of time until they meet a breaking point and do a complete reverse, creating mass revolution and rebellion. Maoism also still influences modern China. One can interpret the conflict as the Confucian family versus the state legalism. The communist state tried to subvert the traditional family, but this failed. As since China opened, there has been a Confucian revival that tries to blend family harmony and obedience into the party's doctrine. China has a weak society, but the Confucian family is still one of the single most important forces. Conservatism in the rest of the world is a conservative system of beliefs. Despite its name's meaning, it has had to rebrand and reinvent itself, while East Asian Confucianism has stayed the same for 4,000 years. It forced a powerful communist state to bend somewhat to it. You can see Confucian legacies in East Asian states such as Singapore or Korea. Their left-leaning forces tend to be more Confucian, while right movements tend to be more legalist. The social conflict over the family and the state of this civilization continues.